Picture this. It's the year 476 after Christ, and the unthinkable is happening. The last Roman emperor of the West, a teenager named Romulus Augustulus, and yes, the irony of that name should make your head spin, is being stripped of his purple robes by a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer. But here's the thing that should really grab your attention. This wasn't just another barbarian king grabbing power. This was the moment when a 1,000-year-old system that had fed millions of people across 3 continents simply stopped working. Think about what Rome actually was at its height. We're talking about a logistical miracle that makes Amazon's supply chain look like a corner grocery store. Egyptian grain ships the size of modern cargo vessels sailing to Britain. Olive oil from Spain reaching soldiers on Hadrian's Wall. Wine from Gaul flowing to legions in Germania. The Romans had created something unprecedented in human history, a continent-spanning posis, economy where a citizen in York could eat bread made from wheat grown in the Nile Delta. And then, overnight, it was gone. When Odoacer's warriors took control, they weren't inheriting a functioning empire. They were inheriting the wreckage of a supply system so complex that nobody fully understood how it worked anymore. Imagine if every Walmart, every Amazon warehouse, every shipping container, every delivery truck in North America suddenly vanished tomorrow. That's essentially what happened to millions of people across the former Roman territories. In abandoned villas from Gaul to Germania, desperate families found themselves facing a brutal reality check. The olive oil wasn't coming from Spain anymore. The grain ships from Egypt had stopped sailing. The salt from Britain, the wine from Italy, the preserved fish from the Black Sea, all of it, gone. These people had to figure out, and fast, how to survive using only what they could grow, hunt, or forage within walking distance of their homes. Now, here's where the story gets really fascinating. The people who survived this collapse weren't the ones who had been living high on the Roman system. They were the ones who still remembered, or quickly relearned, what their ancestors had known before Rome's eagles arrived. And what they discovered, through pure, desperate necessity, would become 7 survival secrets that would carry civilization through the darkest centuries ahead. First came fermentation. Picture a Frankish widow named Gerberga. And yes, we actually have records suggesting people like her existed. She's watching her neighbors die of what medieval chroniclers called the bloody flux, probably dysentery or cholera. Her food stores are running low, winter's coming, and she's got a few heads of cabbage that are starting to go soft. Now, in the Roman system, she would have thrown them away and bought preserved vegetables from a merchant. But there are no merchants anymore. So she does what desperate people do. She experiments. She packs that cabbage in salt water, probably remembering something her grandmother mentioned once about preserved vegetables. And what happens? That cabbage turns into sauerkraut, a food that not only lasts through winter without spoiling, but actually fights off the intestinal diseases that were killing her neighbors. The fermentation process creates beneficial bacteria and vitamins that boost immune function. She didn't know the science, but she sure knew the results. The second secret was wild edible plants. As monastery records from this period show us, knowledge of wild foods spread like wildfire from religious communities to villages. Brother Antonius of Tours, ca. And again, we have actual manuscript evidence of monks like him, documented over 200 species of wild plants that could sustain human life when crops failed. We're talking about dandelions, acorns, rose hips, pine needles, wild garlic, nettle, foods that grew everywhere, but that city-dwelling Romans had forgotten were even edible. Third came the construction of root cellars. These weren't just holes in the ground, they were sophisticated engineering projects that maintained perfect temperatures year-round without any external fuel source. By digging to the right depth and using specific stone and earth construction techniques, these underground chambers stayed at about 38 degrees Fahrenheit in both summer and winter. That's perfect for storing root vegetables, fermented foods, and preserving meat through natural refrigeration. The fourth secret was water purification. Roman aqueducts were marvels of engineering, but they required massive infrastructure and constant maintenance. When that system collapsed, People had to figure out how to make contaminated water safe to drink. They developed techniques using layers of sand, charcoal, and cloth that could filter out pathogens. They learned that certain herbs could kill waterborne parasites, and they discovered that exposing water to sunlight in clear containers would eliminate many dangerous microorganisms. Fifth was small-scale protein production. Instead of relying on massive cattle ranches or sheep herds that required vast pastures, survivors learned to raise rabbits and pigeons in confined spaces. Rabbits could produce 10 pounds of meat per month while eating kitchen scraps and wild plants. Pigeons could be raised in dovecotes and provided both meat and eggs while requiring minimal feed. These weren't just random choices. These animals reproduced quickly, required little space, and could survive on food sources that humans couldn't digest directly. The sixth secret was what they called hunger bread. During the famine of 490, yes, just 14 years after Rome's fall, people learned to make bread from ground acorns, chestnuts, and even certain types of tree bark. This wasn't starvation food. When prepared correctly, these alternative flours provided essential nutrients and could sustain people for months. Oak acorns, when properly processed to remove the bitter tannins, contain more protein than wheat and provide crucial fats for winter nutrition. The seventh and perhaps most crucial secret was communal food storage. Instead of each family hoarding what they could, successful communities developed rotating storage systems that prevented both spoilage and the social breakdown that came from inequality. These weren't communist communes. They were practical arrangements where everyone contributed to shared grain stores according to strict protocols that ensured fair distribution and prevented waste. Now, here's what's absolutely mind-blowing about this transformation. Archaeologists working near the ruins of Roman villas around Trier have found evidence of how quickly this adaptation occurred. Elegant bathhouses that once hosted sophisticated dinner parties were converted into mushroom cultivation chambers. Ornamental gardens where wealthy Romans once strolled among imported flowers were replanted with medicinal herbs and edible plants. Wine cellars that had stored vintages from across the empire became fermentation laboratories, where families learned to preserve vegetables and brew safe drinking beverages. The Germanic chieftain Chlodwig, whom history knows as Clovis, founder of the Frankish kingdom, succeeded not just because his warriors were fierce. He succeeded because his people had mastered these survival arts while his rivals were still waiting for Roman supply wagons that would never come. By the year 500 after Christ, the transformation was complete. An empire of bread and circuses had given way to a world where knowledge of these 7 secrets meant the difference between a thriving settlement and bleached bones scattered in abandoned ruins. But here's the thing that should really make you think. These weren't just desperate survival measures that people abandoned as soon as things got better. These techniques became the foundation of medieval civilization. They were so effective, so reliable, that they spread throughout Europe and sustained populations for the next 1,000 years. And as we'll see, when the next great crisis hit, when Viking longships appeared on the horizon and monastery bells rang out in warning, it would be these same 7 secrets that determined who lived and who died. The question that should be burning in your mind right now is this. If these techniques were so successful, if they sustained entire civilizations through the collapse of Rome and the chaos that followed, what happened to them? How did we forget knowledge that was literally a matter of life and death for our ancestors? And perhaps most importantly, in our own age of increasingly fragile supply chains and complex dependencies, shouldn't we be asking ourselves what we've lost? The great bell of Monte Cassino rang out across the Italian countryside in the year 529 after Christ, and if you could have been standing in those hills listening to that bronze voice echoing through the valleys, you would have been witnessing one of the most important moments in human history. But here's the thing. You probably wouldn't have realized it at the time. Benedict of Nursia wasn't just calling his monks to prayer. He was calling them to participate in what might be the most successful civilization preservation project ever attempted. Think about what this man had created. On the surface, it looked like a religious rule. Wake up at 2 in the morning, pray, work, study, sleep, but dig deeper, and you'll discover that Benedict had designed something far more revolutionary, a survival system disguised as spiritual discipline. Those monks weren't waking up at 2 in the morning from excessive piety alone. They were waking up because fermentation required checking at precise intervals. The pre-dawn hours were perfect for tending the underground chambers, where vegetables transformed into long-lasting sustenance. While most of Europe slept, Benedictine monks were monitoring the bacterial cultures that would keep their communities fed through winter famines and summer droughts. Now, here's where this story gets really fascinating. By the year 800 after Christ, when Charlemagne was building his empire, these monastic communities had become something unprecedented. They were high-tech survival installations scattered across a continent. And Charlemagne knew exactly what he had on his hands. His capitularies, those imperial decrees that carried the force of law, mandated that every monastery maintain gardens containing at least 73 different plants. Not for beauty, mind you, for survival. The emperor himself could recite which herbs stopped bleeding, which roots prevented scurvy, and which mushrooms grown in controlled conditions could feed 100 people through winter. This wasn't just royal hobby knowledge, this was state-sponsored survival science. Charlemagne's favourite story, according to the court chroniclers, involved the monastery of St. Gall in what's now Switzerland. The monks there had discovered that beer wasn't just a pleasant drink that made evening prayers more tolerable. It was a way to make contaminated water safe, while preserving grains' nutrition in liquid form. The brewing process killed pathogens that claimed more lives than Viking axes ever would. Think about that for a moment. These monks had essentially invented a method of water purification and food preservation that required no technology beyond what a medieval community could produce locally. But then came the real test. Viking longships appeared on European coastlines like wolves emerging from a forest, and suddenly everyone got a crash course in the practical value of survival knowledge. The Viking raids revealed something that should make any modern prepper sit up and take notice. When Ragnar's sons attacked Paris in 845, the defenders noticed something odd about their attackers. These Northmen carried strange leather pouches filled with fermented fish and dried meat that remained edible after months at sea. While Christian armies struggled to maintain supply lines for campaigns lasting more than a few weeks, Viking warriors could sail from Norway to Sicily, sustained entirely by preserved foods that weighed almost nothing and never spoiled. The secret spread quickly through European military circles. Within a generation, Frankish armies had adopted similar techniques. But here's what's really remarkable. It wasn't the warriors who perfected these methods, it was the monks. At the monastery of Fulda, Abbot Rabanus Maurus established something that would make a modern research institute jealous: a scriptorium dedicated solely to copying survival manuals. These weren't just recipes scribbled on parchment. These were illustrated guides showing exactly how to build root cellars that maintained 38 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, how to create water purification systems using layers of sand and charcoal, and how to breed rabbits that produce 10 pounds of meat per month in spaces smaller than a monk's cell. The manuscripts from Fulda that survive today, and we're talking about documents over 1,000 years old, contain diagrams so precise that modern engineers have used them to reconstruct medieval preservation systems. One particular manual shows an underground storage complex with separate chambers for different types of fermented foods, each maintained at specific temperatures and humidity levels through careful air circulation design. This wasn't primitive technology. This was sophisticated engineering that achieved results comparable to modern refrigeration using only stone, wood, and an understanding of natural thermal dynamics. The Battle of Lechfeld in 955 demonstrated exactly how survival knowledge translated to military supremacy. Otto the Great's forces weren't just better disciplined than the Magyar raiders they faced, they were better fed. His soldiers carried fermented vegetables that prevented the scurvy that was decimating enemy forces after months of campaigning. His engineers had mastered portable water purification using bronze vessels and crushed charcoal, which meant his army could drink safely from any water source, while their opponents suffered from dysentery and waterborne diseases. But the true revolution wasn't happening on battlefields. It was happening in the women's quarters of every castle and monastery across Europe. There, generations of wise women were perfecting the art of the still room, those mysterious chambers where herbs became medicines, where rose hips and pine needles prevented winter weakness, and where knowledge passed from mother to daughter in whispered recipes that literally meant the difference between life and death. Sister Radegund of Poitiers, whose writings survive in the monastery archives, describes a network of women who could identify over 300 medicinal plants and knew exactly when to harvest each one for maximum potency. These weren't folk remedies passed down through superstition. These were systematically tested treatments that achieved cure rates medieval physicians couldn't match with their imported spices and exotic theories. The really mind-blowing part is how this knowledge was preserved and transmitted. While classical texts were copied and recopied by scholars who often didn't understand what they were transcribing, survival knowledge was kept alive by people who used it every day. A recipe for preventing scurvy using pine needle tea wasn't just words on parchment, it was tested every winter when fresh food ran out. A technique for fermenting turnips wasn't theoretical knowledge, it was the difference between eating and starving when the harvest failed. By the year 1000 after Christ, something remarkable had happened. Europe had become more food secure than the Roman Empire had ever been, despite having a larger population and no centralized supply system. Monastery records show that famines, while still devastating when they occurred, affected smaller areas for shorter periods than they had during Roman times. The reason was simple. Survival knowledge had become democratized. Every village had people who knew how to preserve food, purify water, and maintain nutrition through the worst conditions. The monasteries had become something unprecedented in human history, a distributed network of survival technology centers, each one maintaining and improving upon techniques that could sustain civilization through any conceivable crisis. They were preparing for the end of the world, quite literally. But in doing so, they were actually building a more resilient world than had ever existed before. And they were going to need every bit of that resilience, because ahead lay challenges that would test these systems to their absolute limits. The High Middle Ages were coming, bringing with them population growth, urbanization, and a level of prosperity that would make people forget why these survival secrets had been developed in the first place. The question wasn't whether the knowledge would be tested, it was whether it would survive its own success. The year 1315 should have been the year Europe died. For 3 solid years, rain fell like the biblical flood had returned, rotting crops in the fields and turning fertile farmland into swamps. Contemporary chroniclers wrote of parents eating their children in desperation. And these weren't wild rumors, these were documented accounts from normally reliable sources. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 was the kind of catastrophe that destroys civilizations. Yet in the county of Flanders, something remarkable was happening. Death rates remained surprisingly low. While populations across northern Europe crashed by 10 to 25%, Flemish communities suffered losses of only 3 to 5%. The secret lay not in better weather or richer soil, but in something far more interesting, Countess Margaret's obsession with what we would now call food security. This wasn't some theoretical policy dreamed up by court advisors. Margaret had insisted that every village in her territory maintain communal root cellars filled with fermented turnips and cabbages, underground mushroom cultivation systems, and breeding programs for rabbits and pigeons that could survive on kitchen scraps. Her master gardener, Willem de Vrode, had calculated something that should make every modern urban planner pay attention. 1 acre of intensively cultivated medieval garden could feed 12 people year-round, compared to the 20 acres of grain fields needed for the same result. Think about that ratio for a moment. Medieval peasants, using nothing but hand tools and centuries-old techniques, achieved a 6-to-1 efficiency advantage over conventional agriculture. They weren't just surviving, they were thriving with a fraction of the land area that we consider necessary today. The High Middle Ages had perfected these survival systems into something approaching an art form. By 1200 after Christ, London's population had swelled to 40,000 souls. That's larger than most modern American cities. Yet this medieval metropolis suffered fewer plagues and famines than ancient Rome with half that population. The reason lay in sophisticated infrastructure that would make modern city planners jealous. Thomas Becket, before his famous conflict with King Henry and his eventual martyrdom, had overseen the installation of a water purification system that processed Thames water through a network of sand filters and settling pools before distribution to the city's fountains. Every major monastery now featured underground storage complexes that maintained perfect humidity for grain storage, brewing rooms where water became safe through fermentation, and medicinal gardens containing over 300 species of plants with documented therapeutic properties. But here's where the story gets really fascinating. The military orders, those warrior monks who captured everyone's imagination with their combination of piety and sword work, became unexpected champions of survival knowledge. The Knights Templar weren't just guarding pilgrims on the road to Jerusalem. They were creating the world's first international network for sharing agricultural innovations. Templar commanderies from Scotland to Jerusalem exchanged seeds, breeding stock, and preservation techniques with the efficiency of a modern multinational corporation. A Templar manual from 1250, preserved in the archives at Paris, details how to create what they called travel bread, a twice-baked mixture of grains, honey, and herbs that remained edible for 2 years without any special storage requirements. This wasn't hardtack or survival rations. Accounts describe it as actually pleasant to eat, nutritious enough to sustain hard physical labor, and so reliable that Templar expeditions could carry supplies for multi-year campaigns without resupply. The Hospitallers went even further. They established infirmaries throughout their territories, where herbal medicine achieved cure rates that wouldn't be matched again until the 20th century. We have treatment records from the Hospital of St. John in Jerusalem showing recovery rates of over 90% for conditions that killed most patients in conventional medieval medicine. Their secret wasn't miraculous healing. It was systematic application of nutrition science and herbal medicine that had been refined over centuries of practical use. Sister Hildegard Bingen, whose writings survive in remarkable detail, documented how her convent's combination of proper nutrition through fermented foods and herbal medicines meant her nuns regularly lived past 70 years of age, in an era when 40 was considered elderly. Her records show that sisters who followed the complete regimen of fermented foods, herbal supplements, and regular fasting cycles experienced virtually no infectious diseases and maintained physical vigor well into their 60s. This wasn't just monastic privilege. Similar results were being achieved in secular communities that adopted these practices. The guilds of Bruges, Florence, and the Hanseatic cities developed their own versions of survival wisdom specifically adapted to urban environments. Master craftsmen knew which herbs prevented the lung diseases that came from working with metals and dyes. Merchant families maintained household gardens that could supplement purchased food with medicinal plants and emergency rations. Even common laborers understood basic fermentation techniques that kept their families healthy through winter months when fresh food was impossible to obtain. The records from this period reveal something that should astound modern nutritionists. Medieval people, following traditional preservation and preparation methods, consumed higher levels of vitamins, minerals, and beneficial bacteria than most modern Americans. Fermented vegetables provided vitamin C that prevented scurvy, vitamin K that strengthened bones, and probiotics that supported immune function. Wild herbs gathered from meadows and forests supplied nutrients that aren't available in modern cultivated foods. Game animals and heritage livestock breeds contained higher levels of omega-3 fatty acids and other essential compounds. Urban archaeology has revealed the sophistication of these systems. Excavations beneath medieval London have uncovered elaborate networks of underground storage chambers, each designed for specific types of preserved foods. Separate areas for fermented vegetables, cured meats, dried fruits, and medicinal herbs were connected by carefully engineered ventilation systems that maintained optimal conditions without any external energy source. These weren't primitive cellars. They were carefully designed preservation facilities that rival modern food storage technology. The guild records from Nuremberg describe quality control systems that would impress modern food scientists. Master preservers had to demonstrate their techniques before panels of experts, and their products were tested over multiple seasons to verify shelf life and nutritional value. Apprentices spent 7 years learning not just the basic techniques, but understanding why each step was necessary and how to adapt methods for different climates and conditions. Perhaps most remarkably, this knowledge wasn't hoarded by the wealthy or powerful. The survival wisdom of the High Middle Ages was democratically distributed throughout society. Peasant families knew techniques that kept them healthier than most modern suburbanites. Village healers understood medicinal applications that contemporary physicians struggle to match with pharmaceutical interventions. Even children learned to identify edible and medicinal plants, understand fermentation processes, and recognize signs of contamination or spoilage. The Chronicles of Froissart describe villages where no one went hungry even during regional famines, not because they were wealthy, but because they had maintained the 7 survival secrets as living traditions. These communities could survive complete isolation for years if necessary, producing everything they needed for not just survival, but genuine prosperity within walking distance of their homes. But prosperity, as it turns out, contains the seeds of its own destruction. As Europe entered the late Middle Ages, success began to undermine the very systems that had created it. Wealth from trade made it easier to import food than to preserve it locally. Urban growth created populations disconnected from agricultural wisdom, and then, in 1347, a test arrived that would reveal just how much had already been forgotten. The Black Death was coming, and it would separate those who still remembered the old ways from those who had become dependent on the very systems that prosperity had made fragile. The question wasn't whether Europe would survive. It was whether the survival wisdom that had sustained civilization through its darkest hours would survive prosperity itself. When the Black Death arrived in 1347, carried in the fleas of rats aboard Genoese trading ships, it revealed a truth so stark it should terrify anyone living in our modern interconnected world. Prosperity had made Europeans soft, and they didn't even realize it until it was almost too late. In Constantinople, the greatest city in the Christian world, merchants who had grown wealthy importing spices from India and silk from China died in droves. Their magnificent houses, filled with luxuries from across the known world, became tombs. In Genoa, the banking families who had financed trade expeditions to the Black Sea found that all their gold couldn't buy them safety from pestilence. In London, nobles who dined on preserved delicacies shipped from France and Germany discovered that wealth was utterly useless when the supply chains collapsed and death rode through every neighborhood. But here's what should really grab your attention. In the remote valleys of Switzerland, in the isolated villages of the Pyrenees, in the mountain communities of Scotland that still lived much as their ancestors had 300 years earlier, mortality rates remained under 20%. The difference wasn't luck, and it wasn't geography. It was knowledge. The testimony of Agnolo di Tura from Siena tells the tale with brutal clarity. Wealthy merchants fled their plague-stricken cities, expecting their gold to buy them safety in the countryside, only to find rural communities closing their gates against them. These weren't acts of cruelty, they were acts of survival based on hard-won wisdom. The villagers who turned away wealthy refugees understood something the merchants had forgotten. True security came not from gold, but from knowledge and preparation. These mountain communities survived not through isolation alone, but through systematic practice of the 7 medieval survival secrets that urban populations had abandoned. They burned aromatic herbs that we now know have antimicrobial properties, rosemary, thyme, and sage, that killed airborne pathogens. They consumed fermented foods rich in beneficial bacteria that supported immune function, sauerkraut, and fermented dairy products that strengthened their body's natural defenses. They maintained strict protocols for water purification that prevented the secondary infections that killed as many plague victims as the disease itself. Most importantly, they had never abandoned the practice of maintaining multiple food sources. While city dwellers depended on grain shipments that stopped coming when trade routes collapsed, rural communities still practiced garden cultivation, wild food gathering, small livestock management, and food preservation techniques that could sustain them through any crisis. When the Black Death disrupted commerce for months at a time, these communities barely noticed. They had been self-sufficient all along. But here's the really chilling part of this story. As Europe slowly recovered from the plague years, rebuilding its population and its economy, a fatal shift occurred that set the stage for every crisis that would follow. The Renaissance celebrated classical learning while scorning medieval superstition. Scholars who read Plato and Aristotle in the original Greek dismissed the survival wisdom of their recent ancestors as ignorant peasant folklore. By 1500 after Christ, Venice imported its grain from Cyprus, rather than maintaining local production capabilities. The city that had once been a model of self-sufficiency now depended entirely on maritime trade routes that could be disrupted by any number of factors: storms, pirates, wars, or simple market fluctuations. London relied on coal shipped from Newcastle for heating, instead of maintaining the sustainable coppice woodlands that had provided both fuel and food for centuries. Paris imported wine from Bordeaux rather than supporting local vineyards that had sustained the region since Roman times. The Spanish conquistadors provide perhaps the most ironic example of this forgetting. When Cortés and his men reached Tenochtitlan, they marveled at the Aztec Chinampas, floating gardens that could feed millions of people using sustainable agricultural techniques. These artificial islands, created by weaving together reeds and covering them with lake-bottom mud, produced multiple crops per year while actually improving soil fertility over time. The Spanish recognized genius when they saw it and wrote detailed accounts of these agricultural marvels. Yet at the same time, back in Europe, similar techniques that had been practiced in monastery gardens for centuries were being abandoned as outdated and inefficient. The intensive gardening methods that had sustained European communities through the Dark Ages were replaced by extensive farming that required more land, more labor, and more external inputs, while producing less nutrition per acre. The very innovations that Spanish explorers praised in the New World were being discarded in the Old World as primitive and backward. The 7 survival secrets became quaint antiquities, practiced only by backward rural communities and aging nuns, who were seen as relics of a superstitious past. University-educated physicians mocked herbal medicine while prescribing treatments based on classical texts that hadn't been updated in over 1,000 years. Architects designed grand palaces with no thought for food storage or preservation, assuming that market systems would always provide whatever was needed. Military commanders planned campaigns based on supply lines and logistics, while ignoring the portable preservation techniques that had sustained armies for centuries. And so we arrive at our modern predicament, one that should make every thinking person deeply uncomfortable. Today's preppers stockpile freeze-dried meals with 25-year shelf lives that require complex rehydration procedures and taste like cardboard, while completely ignoring fermentation techniques that create more nutritious foods using only salt, time, and knowledge that anyone can learn. They invest thousands of dollars in solar panels and backup generators, while forgetting that medieval root cellars maintained perfect temperatures using only Earth's natural insulation, and require no electricity, no maintenance, and no replacement parts. Modern survivalists hoard antibiotics with 2-year expiration dates, while the herbs growing as weeds in their own yards could treat most common infections indefinitely, with no degradation of potency. They obsess over bug-out bags and evacuation plans, while ignoring the basic fact that the most successful survival strategy in human history was staying put and knowing how to thrive using local resources. The supreme irony of our situation is this: the medieval techniques that sustained civilization through its darkest hours require no supply chains, no electricity, no special equipment beyond knowledge and practice. A medieval peasant with a root cellar, a fermentation crock, and a medicinal herb garden was more genuinely prepared for catastrophe than a modern suburban family with a basement full of expensive survival gear that depends on global manufacturing and supply chains to replace or maintain. Our ancestors survived the complete collapse of the most sophisticated civilization the world had ever seen. They rebuilt from nothing, using methods that we've forgotten in our rush toward an ever more fragile technological future. The knowledge that carried humanity through the fall of Rome, the Viking raids, the Great Famines, and the Black Death still exists, preserved in scattered manuscripts and practiced by isolated communities that the modern world considers backward and irrelevant. The question that should be keeping you awake at night is this: when our own complex systems inevitably fail, and history suggests they will, because they always have, will we remember these lessons in time? Or will we discover, as wealthy medieval merchants discovered during the plague years, that all our modern sophistication is utterly useless when the fundamental systems that sustain life break down. The medieval survival secrets aren't quaint historical curiosities. They're tested, proven technologies that sustained civilization through repeated collapses. They're techniques that could work just as well today as they did 1,000 years ago, if we had the wisdom to learn them and the humility to practice them before we need them. The choice, as it has always been throughout human history, is ours to make. We can continue building ever more complex systems that require perfect conditions to function, or we can learn from our ancestors who built systems robust enough to survive the end of the world. Because one thing history teaches us with absolute certainty: the end of the world, in some form or another, eventually comes for every civilization. The only question is whether we'll be ready for it.